In what follows, we'll go through a little piece of natural theology. Natural theology deals with the existence and the nature of God, or of the kind of transcendent entity that religion in the narrower sense presupposes or assumes to exist. So, to avoid misunderstandings, natural theology is a purely philosophical discipline. It does not presuppose faith, it does not depend on Christian faith or any faith whatsoever. It is an exercise in pure, unaided reason, and therefore it is also as much as old as philosophy itself. So the question is, does God exist? And if God exists, what is his or its nature? Traditionally, there have been basically two arguments or proofs that God exists. The first is called the ontological argument and was first developed by Anselm of Canterbury. And in a simplified version, the argument says basically that God exists because God is ultimately perfect, and therefore this ultimate perfection implies existence. There are many varieties of this argument, so some varieties rather focus on perfection, whereas others rather focus on the concept, or rather our conception of perfection. And this is why the famous philosopher of religion, John Hick, has once called it the many-faced argument. The second argument is usually called the cosmological argument, first developed by Aristotle and then worked out further by Thomas Aquinas. And again, in a simplified version, it says that given the overall order of the world that surrounds us, the nature that surrounds us, the very fact that natural laws govern nature and make life, and especially human life, possible, is an argument that God exists. And there are many varieties of this argument. So according to one variety, it says that given the world is as it is more probable that God exists than that there is no God. Whereas according to another stricter version, it says the world could not exist if there were no God. So from this argument, it is usually inferred that God, as the creator of the world, must be some intelligent being, and therefore a personal God of theism is inferred from this argument. And the same is done with the ontological argument. So at least according to the standard version, it is an argument not just for the perfection, but for the personality, the personhood of God. There are many defenders of both arguments. So in 19th and 20th century, many philosophers have argued that these arguments are perfectly compatible with the findings of science. So there is no real but only an apparent tension between science and natural theology. And scientists have divided minds about this. So many famous scientists are impressed by the arguments, one or the other, and think that science corroborates this kind of natural theology, whereas others are more critical and think that science is best compatible with materialism and therefore with atheism. But Well, we wouldn't be dealing with philosophy if there were no problems. There are problems and objections against both arguments. So let's start with the ontological argument once again. Remember that we have two readings. According to the one reading, the argument is about God's perfection, and then critics observe that this argument runs the risk of arguing in a circle, of presupposing what it intends to show, that God exists as a perfect entity. If you take the other variety of the argument, the conception, our understanding of perfection, then if you start from that, critics object that the argument is rather about the concept of perfection, but does not show what it has to show, and that is the mind-independent existence of God. If we turn to the cosmological argument, remember the two varieties that we discussed here. If we start from the probabilistic account, which says that given the world as it is more probable that God exists, then critics observe that probabilities might change with new information. And so apart from many technicalities, critics think that this is a fundamental objection, which turns this into a rather weak argument. If we start from the stronger version of the argument, which says that given the world as it is, governed by natural laws and the like, it is impossible that there is no God, then critics wonder what kind of necessity it is that is involved here. It seems to be some necessity that is based on experience, so some empirical or post hoc or a posteriori necessity. And many critics think that we do not have a good account of that kind of necessity until now. So we have problems here, and we should also note that you do not have to be an agnostic or an atheist to find these objections powerful. So many believers and even many theologians have adopted these objections and used them to drive a wedge between thinking on the one hand and science on the one hand and belief and faith on the other hand. So reason and faith are a hot topic in natural theology, but apparently the arguments do not go away so easily. So a lot of work needs to be done, and natural theology remains to be an interesting topic, and the connection between the existence and the nature, the attributes of God, is another topic that always has caught much attention and will continue to do so. The founding idea of our institute has been Neotomism, and in fact Neotomism is outdated by now. So the way it used to exist until the mid of the 20th century, it doesn't exist anymore. But I think this gives us the opportunity to be fair about Neotomism, at least as it was practiced here. So many people think that Neotomism is a dogmatic, narrow-minded, all too traditional way of doing philosophy, but that was not the case in Leuven. If you think of Thomism as such, this is a synthetic enterprise from the start. The idea is to bring the best of philosophy, and that was Aristotle in the Middle Ages, together with the best of theology. And something like that was at work in the founding of this institute as well. So the idea has always been to get into dialogue with all kinds of modern philosophy and modern science. And this is why the Institute of Philosophy here engaged with Neo-Kantian philosophy, with Hegelianism, German idealism. They were very early in reacting towards psychoanalysis, Freudian philosophy, and this also informs the way that philosophy of religion has been done here all the way through. And so Neotomism is not necessarily a restrictive project.